Where is Balake at?
My name's Blake.
What? Do you want to go to war, Balake?
No.
I'm for real. I'm for real. Ron. Where is Ron right now?
Hey everyone, Ron here. Welcome back to the jungle. Today we're going to talk about Grant Cardone and his apparently rapidly imploding real estate empire. As many of you already know, Grant Cardone is one of Scientology's most public and effective recruiters. He is also one of Scientology's largest financial supporters. Grant has donated over $10 million to Scientology. I'm sure the real number might even be closer to 20 million because there's a bunch of different ways that Scientologists donate to Scientology, and that 10 million figure comes from just one of those ways. Because Grant Cardone is such a forward-facing Scientology recruiter, Grant's business activities, even the ones that aren't directly associated with Scientology, are covered very closely by a blog called the Scientology Money Project. And this blog is run by Jeffrey Augustine. And Jeff does some fantastic investigative reporting into all things relating to Scientology. And a lot of the stuff on this blog is about Scientologists defrauding people of millions and billions of dollars. People like Reed Slatkin, David Gentili, and now we're talking about Grant Cardone. So let's see what Jeff Augustine reported recently about Grant Cardone. Cardone Capital hit with rising interest rates. Distributions reduced in July 2022. The July 2022 email sent out to Cardone Capital investors in Equity Fund 18 stated, "This month's distribution was impacted by a $67,000 increase in interest expense due to rising interest rates. Our source tells us the distribution was cut from 6% to 4%. That is a whopping 33% hit on your distribution. This data point would seem to suggest that Grant Cardone's 10-year, 3.75% interest-only loans are variable rate loans, and Cardone Capital is incurring interest rate increases in servicing its loans. As a consequence, the email goes on to state that Cardone Capital is raising rents. Average rent increases of $509 per month. The property is currently 95.7% occupied, trending towards 98% occupied." Grant Cardone claimed that his multifamily deals were designed to cash flow at 85% occupancy. Now this is incredible because if his deals are designed to cash flow at even 85% occupancy, then why is Grant cutting distributions to his qualified accredited investors when his occupancy is north of 95%? This might seem like a minor point to some at first glance, but these minor points, when it comes to ascertaining things like whether an investment is a fraud or whether money was raised for an investment through fraudulent means, these minor points are not so minor. If someone's investing in a deal, they're assessing the risk profile of the deal, they're assessing the potential for future returns. If someone's pitching a deal and they say, this thing is, we're going to guarantee you 6% annualized cash flow, annualized return on your investment from the cash flow of the property, and we're guaranteeing those returns, and those returns, we are in a position to tell you that we can generate those returns for you at even 85% occupancy, that factors into the risk profile of the entire deal. So if you invest in that deal and all of a sudden your distributions are being cut by 66 to 75%, even though the occupancy is north of 95%, that very much indicates a high likelihood of fraud in how Grant Cardone's deals are being marketed and how these funds are being raised. Okay, let's see what else. What happens with future rate increases? Cardone is highly leveraged, and this is where, even at close to 100% occupancy, he has to raise rents due to increased interest rates. Okay, so this is another thing that speaks to potential fraud in how Grant has marketed his deals. And let's even aside from marketing, this might even speak to fraud in the legal disclosures involved in Grant's deals. Grant publicly discusses the fact that he takes 10-year interest-only loans on his deals. But I'll tell you one thing I have never heard Grant publicly discuss, that beyond simply taking out interest-only loans, he took out adjustable rate, variable interest loans. That is absolutely mind-boggling, especially considering that Grant took out most of these loans when interest rates were damn near close to zero. Someone investing with Grant at that time would reasonably conclude that with financing occurring at such low interest rates, that enhanced the risk profile in a positive way. It reduced the risk profile of these projects because with financing being done so cheaply, the likelihood of a property cash flowing and being profitable is greater. For someone looking to invest with Grant, thinking that financing has been locked in at such rock bottom rates makes that, it enhances the attractiveness of that investment opportunity. If Grant failed to disclose to his investors that his projects were financed using variable interest loans, that is fraud. That is undisclosed risk. If you invested with Grant Cardone and you go through your paperwork and there's no disclosures about variable interest financing, you need to talk to an attorney. You need to talk to your attorney general. You need to talk to the local SEC office. You need to pursue recourse. You have been defrauded. Let's see what else Jeff reports here. The other factor at work is that not all Cardone tenants can afford a $509 a month rent increase. Everyone has been hit with sharp price increases on gas, food, and everything else. Thus, if a Cardone tenant living paycheck to paycheck designed their budget around $1,800 a month rent, they cannot afford a 33% increase to $2,309 per month. Accordingly, some percentages of Cardone tenants will vacate and find cheaper housing. If Cardone Capital is cutting distributions by 33% and increasing rents by 33%, then this seems to be Grant Cardone's plan to begin paying his investors the distributions that they were promised. Again, Cardone claimed his deals were designed to cash flow and pay distributions at 85% occupancy, and yet he now has to cut distributions 33% and raise rents at a 95.7% occupancy. To those of you who've paid some attention to how Grant Cardone discusses his deals, you might recall Grant saying something like, he talks about there's a sweet spot in the rental market, and it's like $1,200, $1,300, $1,400. And he's talked about that he would rather keep rents low and keep occupancy high because of the reliability of the repeat income from long-term tenants. And yet here you have Grant talking about raising the rents on his properties by over 30%, raising rents beyond the sweet spot that Grant said is where, based on his experience and expertise, is where you wanted to be for long-term success in the residential rental market. Grant's breaking his own rules, which means either A, Grant's getting very desperate, or B, Grant's rules were bullshit to begin with because Grant really is just a confidence man who's constantly just figuring out how to tell stories that sound good in order to sell people a bunch of bullshit. Now, if you're already a Grant Cardone investor and you're having your distributions slashed, you should know, based on the paperwork you signed, that the way Grant has his deal structured is Grant gets paid regardless. Well, your distributions might be getting cut now, and Grant might even be suspending payments to himself for the time being. Based on the way these contracts are structured, Grant gets paid first, last, and always. So if there's not enough cash flow to pay your distributions and Grant's management fee, and your distributions get suspended, and Grant's management fee gets deferred, once there is enough cash flow, Grant gets paid first. Grant pays himself back for any of his management fee that he didn't get paid for when there wasn't enough cash flow. You don't get your distributions back. Your distributions can be suspended at any time, for any reason, and based on Grant's airtight arbitration agreements, there's very little that you can do about that. But when the cash flow comes back, if the cash flow ever comes back, not only does Grant pay himself the management fee he didn't get paid earlier, he even gets to pay himself interest on the portion of his management fee that got deferred. Grant's getting paid every day, all day, every way. Whether it's yesterday, today, or tomorrow, he's taking your money and it's going in his pocket. But you as the investor, you're the one getting screwed. Let's see what else Jeff has to say here. That Cardone has to increase rents by a significant percentage at close to 100% occupancy should give Cardone watchers pause. Blackstone and the other big investors should be keeping an eye on this to see if buying opportunities develops once Cardone Capital hits its pain threshold. Yeah, this point simply cannot be emphasized enough. Raising rents as significantly as Cardone has discussed, and by the way, it's not just one project. All across the board, Grant is significantly raising rents at his properties. Raising rents to the degree that Grant has said he's raising rents shows an act of desperation. It means the only hope Grant has of these properties cash flowing is the rent increases. Because if the properties were cash flowing at the current occupancy rate and at the current rent thresholds, then you would want to leave it alone. You would want to leave it alone. You wouldn't want to jeopardize. The higher you increase the rents, the higher occupancy rate you're going to have. That turnover, that high turnover from low price leases going to high cost leases creates turnover. It affects occupancy. It's not good. You wouldn't do it unless you had to do it. The fact that Grant has to do it when his properties are already north of 95% occupied, and interest rates have really only begun to go up. If his properties are having cash flow problems right now, then what's going to happen 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the line when interest rates go even higher, as they are very likely to do? Now, in the reporting Jeff did here, he used an example of just one of Grant's funds where distributions were slashed by 33%. I'm going to show you an example of one of Grant's funds where distributions to the accredited investors were slashed by 75%. This is Fund 20. I've taken the information out of the investor relations emails and plunked it into a spreadsheet. Also, the distributions here, going from 800 to 200, I have modified these numbers. If I used the real numbers, then once Grant Cardone and his team sees this video, they would go through all their records and they would look for which accredited investor in Fund 20 had distributions in June of X and in July of X, and they would try to track down who's sharing information with me, and they would probably try to sue this guy for one reason or another. So to protect my sources of information, the raw dollar figures here have been changed. The percentage increase has not. So June 2022 for Fund 20, distributions were, for the sake of this example, we're going to say 800, and we're going to look at the notes that investor relations included in this report. They said that your distributions this month were impacted by higher interest expenses from rising interest rates. The only reason interest expense from rising rates would be occurring is because Grant got variable interest loans. Absolutely fucking crazy to do. Also, you have to ask, why would Grant get variable interest loans? It means he couldn't qualify for fixed rate. There's no other reason. When rates were as close to zero as they were, there's no reason in the world for Grant to have taken out adjustable rate loans unless the bank refused to approve him for fixed rate. And because the risk profile of Grant's projects are so much higher than what he says, Grant's tolerance for risk is much higher than many of his investors seem to understand. Grant was like, interest rates will never go up. What's the problem? And he took out these variable interest loans. Again, absolutely fucking crazy. So he says, impacted by higher interest expense from rising interest rates, the property is currently 95.7% occupied, trending towards 98%. Average of 598 rent increases per month on all new leases. First of all, giving guidance on where you think occupancy is going to go is pretty crazy. That's not the kind of thing an operation would typically have visibility into. You can say where your occupancy rate is now, you can look at it where it's historically been, you can even say where you would like it to be. But to say where it's going, that's honestly very weird, and there's a lot of weird things that come out of the investor relations department over at Cardone Capital. Let's look at the disclosure for the exact same fund the following month of July. And this is the disclosure that just came out this week, but it's for the period of July. Distributions for July was cut 75% from the distributions in June. And the explanation was one additional day of interest expense in July versus June. Net cash flow before interest expense increased by $21,000, primarily due to a $15,000 increase in other tenant income, along with overall expense management. I have no idea what other tenant income could be referring to. The property averaged 94.8% occupied in July, is currently 98% occupied, and achieving average rent increases of $467 per month. Whenever I see contradictory facts coming out of an investor relations department, red flags go up right away. So in June, they said the occupancy rate was 95.7 on its way to 98. But then in July, they actually report a lower occupancy rate than in June, and then they go, but now we're at 98%. You know, numbers typically make sense when people aren't just fabricating them. How can you be at 95.7 in June, say that you're trending up, then for the entire month of July, your occupancy rate actually goes down, but oops, by the way, we're magically at 98% in the first 2 weeks of August. Is it totally impossible for these numbers to be true? It's not totally impossible. But one of the job of investor relations is to explain numbers to investors in a way that makes sense. And when you have bit and piece shoddy explanations coming out of an IR department, you have red flags galore. This is just one example of one IR disclosure from one fund for 1 month. But let's look at the recent disclosures for one of the other funds, fund number 16. Again, these raw dollar figures have been changed, but what hasn't changed is that the distributions for June and July for fund 16, there was no change in those distributions. What I can't tell you is, have these distributions already been reduced, or is this the full 6%? I don't actually know. I'm going to be doing an in-depth research project into the monthly distribution notifications, all of the communications from IR, Investor Relations, that have come out from Grant's operation for all of his funds each month, going back as far as I can, and I'm going to be highlighting for you all of the discrepancies, all of the shenanigans, all the things that don't make sense, the straight up bullshit that comes out of Grant's Investor Relations department. So for this disclosure, for the month of June, we see impacted by a lower occupancy of 2.2%, higher interest expenses from rising interest rates. The property is currently 94.5% occupied, achieving an average of $264 rent increases per month on all new leases. And no guidance is given for where occupancy rates are heading. Okay, the next month's disclosure. $78,000 increase in interest expense due to rising interest rates, 1 additional day of interest expense, blah, blah, blah. Net cash flow before interest increased by $55,000, primarily due to a 2.2% increase in average occupancy, along with an average rent increase of $276 per month. The property is currently 94.7% occupied and trending up. Now, one of the things I look for in communications from IR departments is consistency in reporting and consistency about how guidance is provided. In June, they provided no guidance for where occupancy was heading. In July, they included the occupancy rate and said it's trending up. If a company is only providing guidance on metrics when it expects those metrics to be positive, then a company is defrauding its investors. The role of an IR department is to be open and transparent with investors, not to blow smoke up their asses, and not to withhold bad news. To all you Cardone investors out there, look through all the emails that you've received from Cardone Capital, all the monthly emails with all the updates, all the business updates that accompany your distribution notifications. In any of these disclosures, do they say we're expecting a lower occupancy rate next month? Do any of these emails say we are expecting a higher than normal interest expense or a higher than normal increase in interest expense next month? If you look through all your disclosures and you're not getting any guidance on negative factors that would impact performance, that should be a red flag for you that you're dealing with a company that cares more about bullshit and PR and creating false confidence in investors than it does in being open and transparent and honest with the investors. What I'm talking about in this video, guys, this is just superficial tip of the iceberg stuff. This is nothing compared to what's coming. I'm going to be doing a deep dive into all of the disclosures of all of Cardone's funds for every month. When I have the time and attention and desire to sink my teeth into a project like I'm about to, you're gonna be shocked at the kind of stuff we can extrapolate from the various contradictions and bullshit and flim-flam that comes out of Grant's IR department. My head is gonna be so far up Grant's Investor Relations department's ass, they're not gonna know what hit them. If you're a Cardone investor, the best thing that you can do at this point is to stop giving this guy any more money. This guy keeps begging, trying to raise funds for future projects. How can he raise funds for future projects when he's cutting distributions on his past projects? If you're a Cardone investor and your disclosures do not include information about variable interest loans, please contact an attorney, contact your attorney general, contact the SEC. This kind of fraudulent behavior is only allowed to perpetuate when people feel that their voice is too small or they don't have enough power to do something about it. Collectively, Grant Cardone's investors do have the power to do something about it. I'm going to continue doing the homework on this. I'm going to do videos about everything that I find, but the power lies with you, not me. I'm not a Cardone investor. I don't dislike Grant because he's rich. I dislike Grant because he's a fraud. I dislike Grant because he recruits people to join a family-destroying, bankrupting, human trafficking cult called Scientology. So as long as someone like Grant is out there, not only peddling for a family-destroying human trafficking cult, but also defrauding his investors, then he's gonna have someone like me going through all of his financials, all of his disclosures. Grant's gonna have no choice but to get honest and straight or to cash out his deals and give his investors his money back. And if the stuff I'm able to disclose in my videos results in Grant's investors at least getting made whole, then I will consider that a job well done. All right, everyone, that is all I have for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to this channel for more on this subject. Thank you, of course, to all of you who watch until the very end, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, Oh, Auntie Mama. Then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe right here. Bye.